Moshe. The hangar doors slam shut. 200 people freeze. A janitor laughed at 30 seconds ago is now sitting inside the cockpit of a $40 million experimental helicopter hand, on the throttle, eyes calm as stone. The CEO who mocked him, who said, "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you," suddenly stopped smiling. Because this man isn't just pressing buttons, he's flipping switches no ordinary person should know. Something is about to happen that will change every life in that building forever. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if you believe quiet men often carry the loudest storms inside them, hit subscribe before we begin. The mop bucket squeaked against the concrete floor wheel, catching on a seam, and Ethan Cole didn't look up. He never looked up. Looking up meant someone might look back, and being seen was the last thing a 52,000 square foot hangar full of engineers and executives wanted from the man who emptied their trash cans. "Cole, move it. VIPs coming through in 10. The voice belonged to Russ Dalton, floor supervisor, a man who wore his clipboard like a badge of authority he hadn't earned. Ethan nodded once, said nothing, and pushed the bucket toward the service corridor. He'd learned a long time ago that silence cost nothing, and explanations cost everything. Behind him, the helicopter sat under work lights, like something from another world. Skynova's newest prototype, the Falcon 9X they called it though, nobody outside these walls knew the name yet. Carbon fiber skin, twin experimental rotors, a cockpit wired with more computing power than the space shuttle carried in 1981. Ethan knew this because he'd read the specs pinned to the maintenance board back when nobody was watching, back when the only person paying attention to a 52-year-old janitor was Ethan himself. He also knew something else, something that had been eating a hole in his stomach for 3 days. The tail rotor coupling was cracked. Not broken, not yet. A hairline fracture, the kind of thing that wouldn't show up on a casual walk-around. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd spent 4,000 hours flying aircraft just like this one and knew exactly where metal fatigue liked to hide. Ethan had seen it Tuesday morning while wiping down the tail boom. He'd knelt, touched. It felt the give under his thumb that shouldn't have been there. And he had said something. That was his first mistake. "Excuse me, sir." The chief mechanic, a broad kid named Petrov who couldn't have been older than 29, had turned around with a rag in his hand and an expression that made it clear janitors did not address mechanics unless spoken to first. "There's a hairline crack in the tail rotor coupling," Ethan had said, "right where the drive shaft meets the gearbox. You should pull it before anyone flies this thing." Petrov had laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively, the way you laugh at a child who tells you the sky is falling. "Buddy, that's a titanium alloy coupling rated to 11,000 cycles. I appreciate the concern, but maybe stick to the mop, yeah." Ethan hadn't argued. He never argued. He'd simply nodded, gone back to his cart, and later that night, alone in his apartment after Sophie had gone to bed, he'd written it down in the small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Page after page of notes nobody would ever read. Cracked coupling, tail boom station, 340. Hydraulic line chafing near the transmission deck. Backup avionics failed self-test twice this month, nobody logged it. He wrote everything down because writing it down was the only way he knew how to make the fear feel smaller. He couldn't say it out loud. Saying it out loud got you fired. He'd learned that lesson already a long time ago in a different hangar in a different life he didn't talk about. "Cole," Russ's voice cracked through the hangar again. "I said move. Hayes is walking the floor in 5 minutes, and I don't want you anywhere near the press risers." "Yes, sir," Ethan said, and wheeled the bucket into the shadows near the parts room where invisible men were supposed to stand. Victoria Hayes arrived like weather. That was the only way people at Skynova ever described it. She didn't walk into a room. She arrived, and the air changed pressure around her. 41 years old, third-generation aerospace money, a Stanford engineering degree she'd earned and never let anyone forget, and a public reputation for turning failing companies into billion-dollar darlings through sheer force of will. Today she wore a cream blazer, sharp enough to cut glass, and behind her trailed 6 investors, 2 Pentagon liaison officers, and a documentary crew Skynova's PR team had hired specifically to capture this moment for the history books. This, she announced. Arms spread toward the Falcon 9X, like a magician unveiling the final trick, is the future of vertical flight. Autonomous failover systems, composite rotor architecture, 20% lighter than anything in production. A helicopter that thinks faster than the pilot flying it. Applause rippled through the small crowd. Cameras flashed. Near the back wall, mop in hand, Ethan watched the coupling he'd flagged 3 days ago glint under the lights and felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He should say nothing. He knew he should say nothing. He had Sophie to think about, 7 years old, waiting for him at his sister's house right now, drawing pictures of horses and asking every night when Mommy was coming home, a question he still didn't know how to answer 3 years later. He had rent. He had a job that, humiliating as it was, put food on the table and let him pick her up from school most afternoons. Saying something meant risking all of that for people who had already told him in no uncertain terms that his opinion meant nothing. But then Victoria said the words that changed everything. Today, for the first time, we're not just going to talk about the Falcon 9X's capabilities. We're going to prove them. Live. The room went electric. One of the investors, a heavy-set man in a navy suit Ethan didn't recognize, leaned toward his colleague and whispered something that made them both grin. "Wait," Ethan said. "Wait." The word came out before he could stop it. Quiet, but not quiet enough. Heads turned. Russ's face went the color of ash. "Cole?" Russ hissed, stepping toward him. "What did I just tell you about? Someone shouldn't fly that helicopter today." Ethan said louder now, because once the first word was out, the rest came like water through a broken dam. "There's a crack in the tail rotor coupling. I saw it Tuesday. I told Petrov. It hasn't been fixed." For a moment, nobody spoke. The documentary crew's camera slowly panned toward the man in the gray janitor's uniform standing awkwardly near a mop bucket, and Victoria Hayes turned, her expression flickering between confusion and something colder. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who is this?" He's custodial staff, Ms. Hayes." Russ stammered, already moving to physically insert himself between Ethan and the CEO. "I apologize, he has no business being near the—" "No," Victoria said, holding up a hand. Something in her had shifted from irritation to a kind of dangerous curiosity, the look of a predator that had just noticed something interesting scurry across the floor. "Let him finish. You said there's a crack in the tail rotor." "Yes, ma'am. Right at station 340, where the drive shaft meets." "Yeah." "And how?" Victoria interrupted, her voice sharpening into something the whole hangar could hear now. "Would you know that? Are you an aerospace engineer? A licensed mechanic? Do you hold any certification whatsoever that qualifies you to evaluate a $40 million experimental aircraft?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am." "Then what exactly are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "I clean the hangar floors," Ethan said quietly. Laughter broke out, not everywhere, but enough. A ripple of it from the investors, a smirk from Petrov standing near the tail boom, a barely suppressed snort from one of the junior engineers filming the moment on his phone for the internal Slack channel that would later, against every rule in the employee handbook, leak the video to the entire company by lunchtime. Victoria didn't laugh, not yet. Instead, she walked toward him, heels clicking against the polished concrete until she was close enough that Ethan could smell her perfume. Something expensive, floral, entirely out of place in a building that smelled permanently of jet fuel and machine grease. "Let me understand this," she said, and now her voice carried pitched for the cameras, for the investors, for every single person who'd stopped what they were doing to watch. A janitor. Someone who has never flown an aircraft, never built one, never studied aerodynamics a day in his life, is telling me in front of the Department of Defense, in front of 6 of my largest investors, that my chief engineers and my licensed FAA mechanics have somehow missed a fatal structural defect that he alone was able to spot with a mop in his hand. "I'm not saying I'm smarter than anyone," Ethan said, and his voice for the first time didn't waver. "I'm saying I saw something. I've seen it before. I know what metal fatigue looks like when it's about to fail." "Is that so?" Victoria's smile spread slow and sharp, the smile of someone who had just found the perfect way to end an embarrassing interruption and turn it into content. She turned to the documentary crew, to the investors, to the room. "You know what I think? We have a real opportunity here. A skeptic. Someone with the courage to stand up and question the science. I respect that, I do." "Ms. Hayes." Russ tried again. No, let the man speak his mind." She turned back to Ethan, and something in her eyes glittered with an energy that felt less like respect and more like performance. "Here's what I propose. If you are so certain, so absolutely certain, that this aircraft is unsafe, why don't you prove it?" Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Ma'am." "Fly it." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Somebody actually laughed out loud, a bark of disbelief. "I'm not a pilot," Ethan said. "Of course you're not," Victoria said sweetly, and now she was performing, fully playing to the room like a stage actress who'd found her spotlight. "So you won't fly it because you can't, because none of what you just said has anything to do with real expertise, real training, real engineering. It's fear dressed up as instinct. And I understand that. Machines like this are frightening if you don't understand them." She turned back to the crowd, spreading her arms theatrically. "But you know what? Let's make this interesting. Mr. Cole," Russ muttered, mortified. "Ethan Cole. Mr. Cole, I'll make you a deal right here in front of everyone." Victoria's eyes glinted with something between mockery and showmanship, the confidence of a woman who had never once in her life been proven wrong in a room she controlled. "You fly this helicopter right now in front of all of us, and prove your little theory about the tail rotor. And if you're brave enough to actually get in that cockpit and take off—" She paused for effect. The room held its breath. "I'll marry you." The hangar exploded into laughter. It wasn't gentle laughter. It was the kind that rolled through a crowd like a wave, ugly and loud, investors doubling over engineers, slapping each other's backs, someone actually applauding with slow, sarcastic claps. The documentary camera swung wildly between Victoria's triumphant smile and Ethan's still unreadable face. Petrov was laughing so hard he had to lean against the tail boom, the same tail boom with the crack nobody would listen about. "Oh, come on, everybody," Victoria said, riding the wave, milking it. "Don't be shy. I think that's a fair trade for a man with this much conviction, unless, of course—" "He's all talk," someone shouted from the back, and the laughter surged again. Russ grabbed Ethan's arm, his voice a desperate whisper. "Cole, apologize. Right now. Say you misspoke, say you're sorry, and maybe you still have a job when this is over. Don't make this worse." Ethan looked at him. Then he looked past him at Victoria, standing there in her cream blazer with her arms crossed, and her smile stretched wide. So certain, so absolutely certain that she had just won, that she had put an uppity janitor in his place in front of the cameras, and the money, and the men from Washington. And something inside Ethan Cole, something that had been buried under 3 years of silence and grief and rent checks and small humiliations, finally cracked open. He thought of Sophie. Not the Sophie who needed him quiet and employed and safe. The other Sophie, the one who 6 months ago had asked him why he never talked about flying anymore, because she'd found an old photograph in a box he thought he'd hidden well enough. A photograph of a younger Ethan Cole in a flight suit, standing in front of an aircraft that looked nothing like a janitor's world, grinning next to a woman with red hair and a laugh he could still hear if he closed his eyes. He thought of her question. "Daddy, were you a pilot?" He thought of the answer he'd given her. "A long time ago, sweetheart, in another life." He set the mop against the wall. The laughter faltered first at the edges of the crowd, then spread inward like a chill, as people noticed the janitor was no longer laughing along, was no longer standing frozen with embarrassment, was instead walking calm, unhurried, deliberate directly toward the Falcon 9X. "Cole," Russ said, panic cracking his voice. "Cole, what are you doing?" Ethan didn't answer. He kept walking. Victoria's smile flickered for the first time. "This is a joke, right? Someone stop him before—" "Sir, you cannot approach that aircraft," one of the ground crew shouted, moving to intercept. But Ethan sidestepped him with the kind of economical practiced motion that made the young man hesitate, uncertain, off balance in a way physical contact with a janitor should never have made him feel. The documentary camera swung to follow. Investors stopped laughing entirely now, exchanging confused glances. One of the Pentagon liaisons, a gray-haired man who had been quiet the entire demonstration, straightened up and watched with newly sharpened attention. Ethan reached the cockpit door. "Somebody stop this immediately," Victoria said, her voice rising. No longer performing, genuinely alarmed now, as she watched a man she'd meant to humiliate walk toward a $40 million aircraft like he owned it. "Security, get him away from—" Ethan pulled the door open and climbed inside. The hangar fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the overhead lights suddenly seemed deafening. 200 people stood frozen, watching through the canopy glass as the man they'd laughed at 30 seconds earlier settled into the pilot's seat with an ease that made no sense, that shouldn't have been possible, that no untrained janitor should have been capable of. His hands moved. Not fumbling, not searching, moving across the instrument panel the way a concert pianist's hands move across keys. They've played 10,000 times, instrument scan left to right. Thumb flicking the master battery switch. Fingers finding the fuel pump control without looking, without hesitating, without a single wasted motion. "Someone get him out of there!" Russ screamed, sprinting toward the aircraft, but 2 security guards intercepted him, unsure themselves whether to stop the janitor or stop their own supervisor from causing a scene in front of Pentagon officials. Inside the cockpit, Ethan Cole closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. He heard her voice the way he always did in moments like this. "You've got this coupe. You were born for this seat." His late wife's voice, the one that used to talk him down from every pre-flight nerve he'd ever had, the one he hadn't let himself hear clearly in 3 years, because hearing it clearly hurt too much. He opened his eyes. His hand found the collective. His feet found the pedals like they'd never left them. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he'd locked away since the accident, since the funeral, since the day he decided the safest thing he could do for his daughter was disappear from the sky forever. Something clicked back into place. The engines ignited. The sound cracked through the hangar like thunder, and the crowd staggered backward as the rotor wash kicked dust and loose paper into a violent spiral. Victoria stumbled, one hand flying up to shield her face, her cream blazer whipping against her body, her carefully composed expression collapsing into something raw and afraid. "Turn it off!" she screamed, but her voice was lost beneath the roar of twin engines spinning up to full power, beneath the whine of rotor blades cutting the air with increasing, terrifying speed. Inside the cockpit, Ethan scanned the gauges one final time. Oil pressure green. Rotor RPM climbing steady. Hydraulics nominal. Everything nominal, except the small crack in the tail coupling that only he had noticed, that he now had to fly around, compensate for, manage with a delicacy that would separate a real pilot from a pretender within the first 30 seconds of flight. He keyed the aircraft's radio, more out of habit than necessity, and his voice calm, level. A voice nobody in that hangar had ever heard him use, crackled through the overhead speakers, rigged for the demonstration. "Sky Nova Tower Falcon 9X ready for lift." Silence answered him. Nobody in the control booth even remembered they were supposed to respond. Ethan didn't wait for it. He pulled up on the collective, Deso, and the helicopter that Victoria Hayes had offered as a cruel joke, the machine she'd dared a janitor to fly in front of the entire investment world, lifted smoothly off the hangar floor. No lurch, no wobble, no hesitation, rising into the air with a grace that silenced every single person watching. 200 people stood, frozen necks craned upward, mouths open as the aircraft hovered 10 feet above the concrete with a stillness that looked less like machinery and more like something alive holding its breath. Victoria Hayes stood at the center of it all, blazer torn loose from the rotor wash, hair whipping across her face, staring up at the man she had mocked 30 seconds earlier. A man now floating above her in a helicopter. She had personally dared him to fly with a level of control that made her blood run suddenly, inexplicably cold. "Who?" she whispered, though no one heard her over the engines. "Is that man?" The helicopter hung there in dead air, 10 feet off the concrete, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that hangar remembered how to breathe. Then the aircraft began to move. Not the jerky, uncertain drift of a first-timer, white-knuckling a machine he barely understood. A slow, controlled lateral slide, smooth as a hand gliding across water, the nose staying rock-steady, while the whole airframe shifted 6 feet to the left and stopped dead, hovering again like it had never moved at all. "Oh my God!" someone whispered near the front row. Victoria Hayes hadn't moved. She stood in the wash of rotor air with her blazer torn open at the shoulder seam, hair plastered against her face, staring up through the canopy glass at the man she had publicly humiliated 90 seconds earlier. Her mouth was open. No words were coming out of it. "Ms. Hayes." One of the investors, the heavy-set man in the navy suit, leaned toward her, his voice tight with something between disbelief and excitement. "Ms. Hayes, who trained that man? I don't—" Victoria swallowed. "I don't know." Inside the cockpit, Ethan's world had gone very quiet and very simple. This was the part he'd forgotten he needed. Not the applause, not the vindication, just this. Hands on the controls, instruments telling the truth. A machine that either worked or it didn't. No politics, no clipboard, no supervisor telling him to know his place. Up here, competence was the only currency that mattered. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Cole had more of it than anyone else in the building. Chente. He eased the cyclic forward 2 degrees and felt the aircraft respond exactly the way the math said it should. Good. The primary flight controls were solid. Whatever was wrong with this machine, it wasn't in the parts that would kill you in the first 10 seconds. It was in the parts that would kill you at minute 12. He keyed the radio out of old habit, even though he knew the tower booth had nobody trained to answer him. Falcon 9X coming up on station keeping check. Rotor RPM nominal. Beginning slow pedal turn. The aircraft rotated in place, nose sweeping a slow 360-degree arc, and the entire crowd below turned with it, like sunflowers tracking a moving sun. Petrov, the young mechanic who'd laughed at Ethan 3 days earlier, stood frozen near the tail boom, with his rag still in his hand, staring up with an expression that had gone from smug to something closer to sick. "That's not possible," Petrov muttered. "That's a full authority pedal turn with 0 drift. You don't just do that. Not your first time in an aircraft like this." "He said it wasn't his first time," said the mechanic next to him quietly. "He's a janitor. He's flying that helicopter better than you fly the simulator." Petrov didn't answer. He was watching the tail boom now, watching it with new eyes, remembering the exact spot where Ethan Cole's finger had pointed 3 days ago, remembering the exact words he'd waved away. "Buddy, that's a titanium alloy coupling rated to 11,000 cycles." He hadn't actually checked the cycle count on that coupling. Not personally. He'd taken it from a maintenance log that was supposed to have been updated after the last stress test. A small cold feeling started climbing up the back of his neck. Up in the cockpit, Ethan brought the aircraft into a stable hover at 15 feet and ran his eyes across the instrument cluster one more time. Everything green. Everything normal. Everything except for a number in the back of his mind that wouldn't stop repeating itself. Station 340. The crack he'd felt under his thumb on Tuesday morning sitting somewhere behind him right now, spinning at several thousand RPM, holding the entire tail rotor assembly to the airframe with a fracture he alone had bothered to notice. Mansell. He needed to prove the flaw was real. Not by crashing, by demonstrating exactly the kind of stress that would reveal it before it became catastrophic. That meant doing something no sane test pilot would do voluntarily in an unproven aircraft, deliberately loading the tail rotor system hard enough to make a hairline crack announce itself while staying inside the narrow margin where he could still recover if it did. It was reckless. It was also the only way 200 people were going to believe a janitor over a room full of engineers. "All right," Ethan murmured to himself low enough that only the cockpit heard it. "Let's see what you're hiding." He pushed the pedal. The aircraft yawed hard right, a fast, aggressive pedal input meant to simulate an emergency wind gust correction, exactly the kind of maneuver a chief test pilot would run during a real stress evaluation. For half a second, everything held. Then something at the tail let out a sound like a rifle crack. The helicopter lurched. Screams erupted from the crowd below. Victoria staggered backward, hand flying to her mouth. The aircraft's nose swung wildly to the right, uncommanded, the tail threatening to whip the entire airframe into an uncontrolled spin, the exact failure mode that turns a $40 million prototype into a fireball on a hangar floor in less than 4 seconds. "He's going down!" someone screamed. "Dete." Inside the cockpit, every warning light on the panel ignited at once, and a synthesized female voice began repeating with mechanical calm. "Tail rotor authority degraded. Tail rotor authority degraded." Ethan's heart didn't spike. It should have. Instead, something older and colder took over muscle memory, built across 4,000 flight hours, and one accident. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget muscle memory. That didn't care about fear, because fear was a luxury for people on the ground. His hands moved before his brain finished processing the failure. Left pedal full input. Collective down, 2 inches to bleed rotor RPM, and reduce torque demand on the failing coupling. Cyclic forward and left to counter the yaw with translational lift instead of relying on a tail rotor that could quit completely at any second. The aircraft stopped spinning. It hung there, shuddering nose still cocked 20 degrees off-center, but level, stable, alive. For 3 full seconds, the entire hangar existed inside that shudder, waiting to see if the machine would fall out of the sky or hold together long enough to matter. It held. "Oh my God," Victoria whispered, both hands pressed against her mouth now. "Oh my God. Get him down. Somebody get him down." "He is getting himself down," the gray-haired Pentagon liaison said sharply. Stepping forward, eyes locked on the aircraft with an intensity that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "Look at his control inputs. That's not panic. That's a diagnosed failure response." Inside the cockpit, sweat had broken across Ethan's forehead, but his voice, when he keyed the radio again, came out flat and controlled. "Falcon 9X declaring an emergency. Tail rotor coupling has failed partial. I have directional control using translational lift and reduced collective. Requesting clear landing zone. I'm bringing her down now." Nobody answered him. Nobody in that control booth knew how. It didn't matter. He didn't need them to. But he began a slow, deliberate descent, fighting a helicopter that wanted to spin itself into the concrete, using nothing but forward speed and precise pedal inputs to keep the nose from swinging out of control. A maneuver that existed in emergency procedure manuals as a theoretical last resort. The kind of thing instructors taught in simulators and hoped their students never had to use for real. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6. Bottom 2. The crowd had gone completely silent now, 200 people holding their breath in perfect unison, watching a man they'd laughed at 90 seconds earlier fight a dying aircraft down out of the sky with nothing but his hands and a discipline none of them had known he possessed. 4 feet. The tail let out another crack, louder this time, and the aircraft's nose swung hard right without warning. "No!" Petrov screamed, lunging forward instinctively, even though there was nothing he could do from the ground, nothing anyone could do. The whole demonstration collapsing into the exact disaster the janitor had warned them about 3 days ago, and nobody had bothered to check. Ethan slammed full opposite pedal and dumped the collective in one smooth motion. The skids hit the concrete hard enough to bounce hard enough to send a shockwave through the airframe, but they hit level both sides together. No rollover, no fireball, no catastrophe. The engines screamed down through their shutdown sequence, rotor blades slowing from a blur to individual visible arcs. And then finally, silence. Real silence. The kind that comes after something almost went terribly wrong and didn't. Nobody moved. Then the cockpit door opened, and Ethan Cole climbed out on legs that were shaking slightly, the only visible sign that what had just happened had cost him anything at all, and stood there in his gray janitor's uniform in front of 200 people who were staring at him like he'd just walked out of a burning building carrying a child. Victoria Hayes was the first to move. She crossed the space between them at a near run, her torn blazer flapping her professional composure completely abandoned. "Are you insane?" she said, and her voice cracked on the word, somewhere between fury and something that sounded almost like fear for him. "You could have died. Do you understand that? You could have died in front of my investors, in front of the Pentagon, in front of—" "I told you the coupling was cracked," Ethan said quietly. That stopped her. "I told Petrov on Tuesday. I told him exactly where to look. He told me to stick to the mop." Ethan's voice wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was tired of a man who had spent 3 days carrying a warning nobody would let him deliver any other way. "I climbed into that cockpit because I knew if I said it one more time from the ground, you were going to fly this thing with a paying test pilot inside it and government money riding on it, and that pilot was going to die exactly the way I almost just did. Except I know how to recover from a tail rotor failure. Most people don't." Silence spread through the hangar like spilled water. "How?" Victoria said slowly, each word deliberate. "Does a janitor know how to recover from a tail rotor failure at 15 feet? Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted unconsciously to the tail boom of the aircraft behind him, to the exact spot where the coupling had failed, now visibly cracked clean through exactly where his thumb had found the fracture 3 days earlier. "Somebody check that coupling," he said instead. "Cut section, don't just inspect it visually. You'll find fatigue striations going back at least 40 flight hours. Whoever signed off on that part during acceptance testing either didn't run ultrasonic inspection or ignored the results." The gray-haired Pentagon official had already pulled a phone from his jacket and was speaking rapidly into it, low and urgent. 2 of the investors were staring at Ethan with expressions that had shifted from disbelief to something closer to hunger, the specific hunger of men who had just watched a fortune almost evaporate and were recalculating in real time exactly what this man might be worth. Russ Dalton pushed through the crowd, face-pale, clipboard forgotten somewhere on the hangar floor. "Cole, Ethan, what in God's name did you just do?" "My job," Ethan said. "Same as always. Nobody just listened until I had to prove it the hard way. You're fired." Russ blurted, some old reflex kicking in even now, even with the CEO standing 3 feet away, even with the entire demonstration collapsed into chaos. "You left your assigned duty station, you interfered with a company aircraft, you—" "Russ." Victoria's voice cut through him like a blade, quiet and absolutely final. "Stop talking." Russ stopped talking. Victoria turned back to Ethan, and something in her face had rearranged itself completely. The mockery gone, the performance gone, replaced by a hard, calculating focus that made her look for the first time all day like the woman who had actually built a billion-dollar aerospace company, instead of the woman who'd wanted a viral moment for the documentary crew. "Who are you?" she asked again, and this time it wasn't rhetorical, wasn't theater. It was a real question asked by someone who genuinely needed the answer. Ethan looked at the crowd around him. The engineers who'd laughed, the mechanics who'd told him to stick to the mop, the investors filming everything on their phones, now no longer for entertainment, but for evidence. He thought about Sophie, about the quiet life he'd built specifically so nobody would ever ask him this question again. "Just somebody who used to fly aircraft like this one," he said. A long time ago. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got today. He turned to walk away back toward the parts room, back toward the mop bucket, back toward the invisible corner of the world he'd carved out for himself. But Victoria's voice stopped him before he'd taken 3 steps. Mr. Cole. He turned. The coupling, she said. You knew exactly where to find the fracture. Station 340, fatigue striations, cycle count discrepancies. That's not janitor knowledge. That's not even mechanic knowledge. That's engineering-level materials analysis combined with flight test experience most licensed pilots never get anywhere near. Her eyes narrowed sharp and searching. I've reviewed personnel files for every test pilot program in this country for the last 15 years. I don't forget faces, and there's something about you that feels... She stopped herself. Familiar, said the gray-haired Pentagon official, quietly stepping forward for the first time. He'd finished his phone call and was studying Ethan now with the particular intensity of a man cross-referencing a memory against a face. Say your full name again, son. Ethan Cole. The older man's expression flickered not quite recognition, but close enough that Ethan felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Not Ethan Marcus Cole, the official said slowly. Call sign? Coop. The hangar went very still. Ethan's face lost color. Where did you hear that name? I was at Edwards in '09, the official said, and now there was something almost reverent in his voice, the tone of a man realizing he was standing in front of a ghost. Experimental Rotorcraft Division. There was a test pilot back then, best stick and rudder skills anybody had seen in a decade on track for a program director slot before. He stopped himself abruptly, some old instinct for tact kicking in. Before what? Victoria demanded. When the official looked at Ethan with something that might have been an apology forming behind his eyes. Before the accident. The word landed in the hangar like a dropped weight. Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been steady through an actual mechanical failure at 15 feet off the ground 90 seconds earlier, curled slowly into fists at his sides. I don't talk about that, he said, and his voice had gone flat and hard in a way it hadn't been even in the cockpit. Ethan, Victoria started. I said I don't talk about that. He turned and walked faster now, weaving through the frozen crowd toward the service corridor, toward the mop bucket, toward the exit that led out of this hangar, and back toward the quiet, careful, invisible life he'd spent 3 years building. Brick by brick, specifically so nobody would ever say that word to him in public again. Nobody stopped him this time. 12 minutes later in the employee parking lot, Ethan sat in his 10-year-old sedan with both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing, his whole body shaking with an adrenaline crash that had nothing to do with the flight and everything to do with 2 words a stranger had said out loud in front of 200 people. Coop. Nobody had called him that in 3 years. Nobody was supposed to know that name existed anymore. He'd buried it the same week he'd buried his wife, the same week he'd signed the paperwork, walking away from the only career he'd ever loved. The same week he'd driven 600 miles from the base where the accident happened to a city where nobody knew his face, and started applying for jobs that required nothing but a willingness to be invisible. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Guy. A text from his sister. Sophie wants to know if you're coming for dinner. She drew you a picture of a helicopter today at school. Isn't that funny? Everything okay? Ethan stared at the message for a long time. His hands were still shaking. Everything's fine, he typed back. On my way. Tell her I love the picture. He set the phone down and finally allowed himself one long, unsteady breath. The knock on his window nearly stopped his heart. Victoria Hayes stood outside his car blazer, still torn at the shoulder. Mascara slightly smudged from wind and adrenaline, looking nothing like the composed billionaire who'd humiliated him an hour earlier. Ethan rolled the window down slowly. Ms. Hayes. You can't just leave, she said. Watch me. Ethan. She said his first name for the first time, and something in the way she said it made him pause. You just saved my company from a disaster that would have killed a test pilot, embarrassed my investors, and probably ended a government contract worth $200 million. I have a documentary crew inside that just captured what might be the most extraordinary 6 minutes of footage I've ever seen. Reporters are already calling. And I don't even know who you actually are. I'm nobody. I clean floors. That's a lie, and we both know it. Her voice softened slightly, though the sharpness never fully left it. That Pentagon official, Colonel Whitfield, he wants to talk to you. He says the man he remembers from Edwards Air Force Base was one of the finest experimental test pilots this country ever trained. Someone who disappeared off every record after a fatal accident. Nobody in the program ever fully explained. Is that you? Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. I lost my wife in that accident, he said quietly. And for the first time, his voice cracked in a way it hadn't cracked in front of anyone in 3 years. It wasn't the aircraft. It wasn't pilot error, whatever they wrote in the report. It was a system failure nobody wanted to admit to because admitting it would have grounded an entire program and cost the Air Force a contract worth billions. I know because I flagged the same failure mode 6 months earlier and got told word for word to stick to what I was trained for and stop second-guessing the engineers. Victoria went very still. So when I say I saw a crack in a tail rotor coupling, Ethan continued, his voice rising now, 3 years of buried grief finally finding an outlet. And your mechanic tells me to stick to the mop. You'll forgive me if that sounds a little bit familiar. You'll forgive me if I decided this time I wasn't going to let somebody's ego kill another person while I stood there quietly cleaning up the mess afterward. Ethan, I have a daughter, he said, cutting her off, the words tumbling out now, like something long damned finally breaking loose. She's 7 years old. She lost her mother because a room full of very confident, very credentialed people decided a test pilot's warning wasn't worth the cost of grounding a program. I promised myself I would never put myself in a position again where people like that could get somebody I love killed. So I disappeared. I took a job where nobody asks questions, where nobody expects anything from me, where the worst thing that can happen is somebody yells at me for not emptying a trash can fast enough. And it was working. It was fine. Sophie was safe. I was invisible, and that was enough. He looked up at her eyes, wet jaw tight. And then you stood in front of 200 people and dared me to fly a helicopter I already knew was going to fail because it was funnier than actually listening to a janitor. So yeah, I flew it. And I almost died proving something I already told your mechanic for free 3 days ago. The parking lot went quiet, except for the distant sound of hangar doors rolling shut somewhere behind them. Victoria Hayes stood there for a long moment, and something Ethan had never expected to see on her face slowly assembled itself. Not pity, which he would have hated, but something closer to genuine shame. I'm sorry, she said, finally quietly. No cameras, no crowd, no performance left in her voice at all. I am. I built my entire company culture around confidence, around never showing weakness in front of investors, and somewhere along the way that turned into arrogance, and today it almost got somebody killed. That's on me, not on you. Ethan said nothing. But I need you to understand something, she continued. That coupling failure, if it had happened during the actual government demonstration next month with an actual licensed test pilot who didn't have your specific experience with tail rotor emergencies, that pilot dies. My company gets shut down by federal investigators. Every person in that hangar loses their job. You didn't just save my ego today, Ethan. You saved everything. Every single person who works here. I know, Ethan said quietly. That's why I climbed in. Then let me do something for you. I don't want anything from you. I know you don't, Victoria said, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in her voice. That's exactly why I need to. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, exhaustion and grief and old anger warring behind his eyes. I need to pick up my daughter, he said finally, and started the car. Jai. Victoria stepped back from the window, but as he began to pull away, she called out one last thing loud enough to carry over the engine. Colonel Whitfield is filing an emergency report tonight, Ethan. About the coupling. About what happened. Your name is going to be in it whether you want it there or not. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel, and for a moment he didn't move the car at all. Yes, because somewhere underneath 3 years of careful invisibility, underneath a name he'd buried alongside his wife, a small, cold certainty was beginning to surface that whatever quiet life he'd built for himself and Sophie in this city, it had just ended in a hangar full of cameras, and there was no putting that particular genie back in the bottle. He drove away without answering her. But in the rearview mirror, he could see Victoria Hayes standing in the parking lot watching his taillights disappear, already pulling out her phone to make a call that would put the name Ethan Coop Cole into a federal incident report, and though neither of them could have known it yet, into every news feed in the country by morning. Sophie was waiting at the window when he pulled into his sister's driveway, her small face pressed against the glass, and the second she saw his car, she was out the front door before he'd even put it in park, sprinting across the lawn in her socks. Daddy. Ethan barely had time to open the car door before she crashed into him, arms wrapping around his waist with the kind of desperate full-body hug that 7-year-olds gave when they'd been thinking about something all day and finally got to let it out. Hey, easy, sweetheart. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around her, and for one full breath, the hangar, the cameras, the word Coop echoing in his skull, all of it went quiet. What's wrong? Aunt Carol showed me a video, Sophie said, pulling back her eyes wide and searching his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. On her phone. There's a video of a man flying a helicopter and everybody's screaming, and it looks just like you, Daddy. It looks exactly like you. Ethan's stomach dropped through the floor. Sophie. Is that you? She demanded, and there was something fierce in her voice now. Something that had been building for 3 years, ever since she found that photograph in the box he thought he'd hidden well enough. Were you flying it? Is that why you never talk about being a pilot? Daddy? Please, just tell me the truth. His sister Carol appeared in the doorway behind her phone, still in her hand, her face pale. Ethan, she said quietly, it's already got 400,000 views. It went up 20 minutes ago. Ethan closed his eyes. 400,000. Can I see it? He said, though every part of him didn't want to. Carol handed him the phone with visible reluctance, and Ethan stared down at a paused frame himself, midair, hovering in the Falcon 9X, caught from an angle that made the whole moment look even more dramatic than it had felt from inside the cockpit. The caption underneath read, Janitor saves billionaire's helicopter demo. Who is this man? Below it, the comment count was already climbing past 2,000. Daddy, Sophie said again, quieter now, her small hand finding his. Please. Ethan looked down at her at the same green eyes her mother had, the same stubborn set of her jaw, and understood in that moment that the careful lie he'd told her for 3 years, the gentle deflection about a long time ago in another life, wasn't going to survive the internet. Yeah, baby, he said finally, his voice rough. That's me. Sophie's eyes went enormous. You can fly a real helicopter. I used to. Why did you stop? No, there it was. The question underneath every question. Ethan felt his throat tighten, felt Carol watching him from the doorway, with the particular helpless sympathy of a sister who had spent 3 years respecting his silence and knew this was the moment it finally cracked. Because something happened, Ethan said slowly, choosing each word like it might explode in his hands. That made me very scared to keep flying. And I decided the safest thing I could do for you was to stop and to find a quiet job and to make sure nothing like that ever happened to us again. Did it have to do with Mommy? Ethan's breath caught. Carol stepped forward. Sophie, sweetheart, why don't we let Daddy come inside and... It's okay, Ethan said quietly, holding up a hand. He looked back at his daughter, who was watching him with a patience and gravity that felt far too old for a 7-year-old, and he made a decision he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Yeah, baby, it had to do with Mommy. I'll tell you more when you're a little older. I promise. But not tonight. Okay. Tonight I just want to eat dinner with my girl and not think about helicopters at all. Sophie studied him for a long moment, and then in the way that children sometimes understand mercy better than adults do. She simply nodded and took his hand. Okay, Daddy, but you have to tell me the whole story someday. Promise. I promise. They walked into the house together, and for exactly 40 minutes over spaghetti and a plate of garlic bread Carol had clearly made with shaking hands. Ethan Cole almost managed to forget that his entire carefully buried past had just detonated in front of 200 people and a documentary crew. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then some old instinct. The same instinct that had told him 3 days ago to check the tail rotor coupling made him pick up. Ethan Cole. A woman's voice, brisk professional. Who's asking? My name is Denise Park. I'm a producer with National Nightly News. We got hold of the footage from Sky Nova's demonstration today, and we would love the opportunity to... Ethan hung up. The phone rang again, 30 seconds later. Different number. Mr. Cole, this is with the Associated Press. We're doing a story on the Sky Nova incident, and we understand you have a background as a... He hung up again. By the time the fourth call came in, Sophie had stopped eating and was watching him with wide, worried eyes, and Carol had reached over and gently taken his phone out of his hand. Let me handle this, she said. Eat something. Carol, you don't understand. This isn't going to stop. I know. She was already scrolling through his notifications with a grimace. You have 41 missed calls, Ethan. 41 in the last hour. Ethan put his fork down. His appetite had evaporated completely. There's more, Carol said slowly, still scrolling. You've got messages from 3 different news networks, 2 literary agents. Apparently somebody wants to write a book about this already, and... She paused, frowning at the screen. This one's from Sky Nova's legal department. Legal department. Why would legal be calling me? Carol turned the phone around so he could see the message preview. Mr. Cole, this is Marcus Webb, General Counsel for Sky Nova Aerospace. Given today's incident and the ongoing federal review, it is critical that we speak before you engage with any media outlets. Please call at your earliest convenience. This is time sensitive. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. Federal review, he repeated. That's what it says. No. Across the table, Sophie was watching all of this unfold with the particular silent intensity of a child who understood without being able to name it that something big and frightening was happening around her father. Daddy, she said quietly, are you in trouble? Ethan reached over and squeezed her small hand. No, sweetheart. I don't think so. I just told the truth about something, and sometimes when you tell the truth, it gets loud before it gets quiet again. So, he hoped as he said it that it was true. The knock came at 9:40 that night. Ethan had just gotten Sophie down. She'd fallen asleep clutching the crayon drawing she'd made him that afternoon. A lopsided helicopter with a stick figure in the cockpit, wearing what was unmistakably a mop and bucket-shaped hat, which had made him laugh for the first time all day when the doorbell rang sharp and insistent, followed almost immediately by another knock. Carol answered it. Ethan heard voices in the hallway, low and urgent, and then his sister appeared in the doorway of the guest room with an expression he didn't like at all. Ethan, it's Victoria Hayes. She's here, in person. Here at your house. She says it's important. She's got someone with her older guy military bearing. Says his name is Colonel Whitfield. Ethan's stomach tightened. He'd hoped foolishly that the conversation in the parking lot had been the last of it. He walked out to the living room and found Victoria Hayes standing just inside the front door, no longer in the torn cream blazer from that afternoon, but in a simple dark coat, looking smaller, somehow more human, without the crowd and the cameras around her. Beside her stood the gray-haired man from the hangar still in uniform, holding a manila folder against his chest like it weighed more than it should have. Mr. Cole. Colonel Whitfield said, extending a hand. "I apologize for the hour, and for the intrusion into your home." Ethan didn't take the hand right away. "How did you find where I live?" "Your employment file," Victoria said quietly. "I'm sorry. I know that's not a comfortable thing to hear, but what we need to tell you couldn't wait until tomorrow." "Say it then." Colonel Whitfield exchanged a glance with Victoria, then opened the manila folder and pulled out a thin stack of paper. "2 hours ago, I filed an emergency preliminary report with the Department of Defense regarding the failure you identified and demonstrated today," he said. "As part of that report, I had to explain how a member of custodial staff was able to identify a structural defect that passed both visual inspection and apparently ultrasonic testing, which meant I had to explain who you are." "I already told you," Ethan said, his voice tightening. "I don't talk about that. I understand. But it is out of your hands now, son, and I think you know that." Whitfield's voice was gentle but firm. "Within an hour of my report going in, I got a call back from someone at the NTSB. They pulled the old case file, the one from '09. The room went very still. "What case file?" Carol asked quietly, standing protectively near the hallway that led to Sophie's room. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter." "It matters a great deal, actually," Whitfield said, and something in his voice made Ethan's chest go cold. "Because the failure mode you identified today, the tail rotor coupling fatigue, the exact fracture pattern, it's nearly identical to a failure that was documented and dismissed in a test aircraft accident report from 17 years ago. An accident that killed one crew member and was officially attributed to pilot error." Ethan's hands had begun to shake. "That was my wife's accident," he said quietly. "I know," Whitfield said. "I was there, Ethan. I was on the review board, and I have spent 17 years believing the official finding, because that's what the paperwork said. And because the young pilot who tried to tell us otherwise, the pilot who said he'd flagged the exact same coupling failure 6 months earlier and been overruled, disappeared from the program before we could finish the follow-up interview." The silence in that living room stretched so long that Ethan could hear Sophie's box fan humming softly down the hall. "You disappeared," Whitfield continued, "because 2 weeks after the accident, you were told off the record by people above my pay grade that if you kept pushing the coupling failure theory, you'd be looking at a court-martial for endangering a classified test program. Am I right?" Ethan's throat had gone completely dry. He hadn't heard anyone say those words out loud in 17 years. He'd barely let himself think them. "Yeah," he said finally, barely a whisper. "That's exactly what happened." Victoria's face had gone pale. "Wait. You're telling me the exact same defect that killed his wife in a military test aircraft in 2009 showed up again today in a civilian aircraft at my company?" "That's what I'm telling you," Whitfield said grimly. "And that means somewhere in the supply chain, the manufacturer of that titanium alloy coupling, whoever certified it, whoever's been selling that part into both military and civilian test programs for the last 2 decades, there is a defect that has never been fixed. And it has now killed at least once, and today it very nearly killed twice." Ethan sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, his legs suddenly unwilling to hold him. "Nearly killed twice," he repeated. "You're saying this isn't an isolated part failure. You're saying this is systemic." "I'm saying," Whitfield said carefully, "that I believe your wife's accident was never properly investigated because doing so honestly would have grounded a $9 billion defense contract. And I believe the same part, same manufacturer, potentially the same production batch flaw, is still in circulation today, 17 years later, because nobody with the authority to stop it wanted to admit the mistake." Carol had gone white. "Ethan, I need to sit with this," Ethan said, his voice unsteady. Give me a minute." Victoria took a step closer. "Ethan, I know this is a lot. I know I'm the last person who has any right to ask you for anything after how I treated you today, but I need your help. If this coupling is defective across multiple aircraft, multiple programs, that means there could be other test pilots out there right now flying with the exact same hidden failure sitting behind them, waiting. And you want me to what exactly? Ethan's voice cracked with something between grief and fury. Relive the worst day of my life in front of federal investigators. Testify about my wife's death in some hearing room while lawyers try to protect a defense contractor's stock price. I want you to help us find every single aircraft that part was installed in, Victoria said. Before one more person dies the way your wife did. Before one more family gets the same phone call yours did. Ethan flinched like she'd struck him. That's not fair, he said quietly. I know it's not, Victoria said, and to her credit she didn't look away from him. I'm not going to pretend it is. I mocked you in front of 200 people 8 hours ago, because I couldn't imagine a janitor knowing more than my engineering team. I was wrong about that in a way that could have gotten someone killed. I don't get to ask you for comfortable favors after a day like today. But I am asking you anyway, because you are the only person alive who has personally survived this exact failure twice 17 years apart, and that makes you the single most valuable person on Earth for figuring out how deep this actually goes. Whoa. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his hands, the same hands that had steadied a dying helicopter that afternoon, the same hands that had once 17 years ago held his wife's hand in a hospital hallway while doctors told him there was nothing more they could do. How many aircraft, he said finally, are we talking about? Colonel Whitfield opened the folder again, pulling out a second document. That coupling has been in production under different part numbers, but the same core manufacturing process since 2004. It's been used in at least 6 military test programs, and as of 2 years ago, was licensed for civilian experimental aircraft use, which is how it ended up in Skynova's Falcon 9X. He paused. Conservatively, we're looking at somewhere between 40 and 60 aircraft that could have that part installed right now. 60 aircraft, Ethan repeated numbly. Some of them flying active missions within the month, Whitfield said quietly. Ethan closed his eyes. He thought of his wife's face, laughing healthy 3 days before the accident that took her from him. He thought of Sophie asleep down the hall with a crayon drawing of a helicopter clutched in her small hand. He thought of every single family out there right now who had no idea that somewhere in their loved one's aircraft sat a fracture identical to the one that had already killed once and nearly killed twice. All right, he said finally, opening his eyes. I'll help, but I have conditions. Name them, Victoria said immediately. First, my wife's case gets reopened, formally, officially, not buried in some footnote of a bigger investigation. Her death gets acknowledged as what it actually was, not what the paperwork said 17 years ago. Done, Whitfield said without hesitation. I'll personally see to it. Second, Sophie doesn't get dragged into any of this. No cameras near my daughter, no reporters near her school, nothing. She's 7 years old, and she's already had one parent taken from her by exactly the kind of corporate cover-up you're describing. I won't let her be collateral damage in the media circus this is about to become. Agreed, Victoria said firmly. I'll have my legal and PR teams build a firewall around your family starting tonight. Third, Ethan's voice hardened. If we find out anyone at that manufacturer knew about this defect and buried it, I want them held accountable. Not fined, not settled quietly. Held accountable publicly the way nobody was held accountable for my wife. Victoria held his gaze steadily. I promise you, Ethan, whatever we find, it comes out. All of it. Even if it's ugly for my own company's supply chain relationships. Even if it costs us contracts. Ethan studied her face for a long moment, searching for the performance, the calculation, the same showmanship that had turned a legitimate safety concern into a public humiliation 8 hours earlier. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something rawer, a woman genuinely shaken by how close she'd come that same afternoon to getting somebody killed for the sake of a good investor demo. Okay, he said finally. I'm in. The next 4 days moved in a blur that Ethan would later struggle to fully remember, one event bleeding into the next with the surreal speed of a life turned suddenly, irreversibly public. By Tuesday morning, the hangar footage had crossed 8 million views. By Tuesday afternoon, Ethan's name, his full name, his military service record, even a grainy photograph of him in his old flight suit standing beside his late wife, had been published by 3 separate news outlets, despite Victoria's legal team scrambling to get ahead of it. Sophie came home from school that Wednesday in tears, and it took Ethan 20 minutes of gentle coaxing to get the story out of her. A classmate had shown the other kids a video on their tablet during recess. A video of Ethan's face next to the words, "hero or fraud." The janitor who claims he flew for the Air Force, and the other kids had started asking Sophie if her dad was famous, if he was rich now, if it was true, he'd almost died. "I didn't know what to say." Sophie had sobbed into his shoulder that night. "I didn't know if I was supposed to be proud or scared." "Both," Ethan told her quietly, holding her tight. "It's okay to feel both, baby. I feel both, too." Thursday brought the first real break in the investigation, and the first real gut punch. Ethan sat in a conference room at Sky Nova's headquarters, a room he'd never have been allowed into, a week earlier surrounded by Colonel Whitfield, 2 NTSB investigators, and Victoria Hayes staring at a spread of documents that had just been pulled from a manufacturer's archived quality control records under federal subpoena. "Here," said one of the NTSB investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Reyes, sliding a folder across the table. "Batch report from 2008. Look at the ultrasonic test results on this production run of tail rotor couplings." Ethan scanned the document, his stomach turning cold as he read. "These are failed tests," he said slowly. "Every single coupling in this batch failed ultrasonic inspection for internal fatigue stress. It's right here in black and white. Now look at the shipping manifest attached to the same batch number," Reyes said quietly. Ethan flipped the page. His hands had begun to shake. "They shipped anyway," he whispered. "They shipped the entire batch anyway, including—" His eyes found the line item, and everything in him went very still. "Including a coupling installed in an experimental rotorcraft at Edwards Air Force Base. Serial number matches the accident aircraft, my wife's aircraft." The room went silent. "Somebody knew," Ethan said, his voice rising, cracking with 17 years of buried grief finally finding a target. "Somebody looked at a failed test result and shipped the part anyway, and 6 months later, my wife died, and they let the Air Force write it off as pilot error instead of admitting they'd shipped a known defective part to save a production deadline." "Ethan," Victoria said quietly, "we're going to find out exactly who signed off on that shipment, I promise you." "I don't want a promise," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I want a name." Colonel Whitfield leaned forward, his own face gray with the weight of what they were uncovering. "We'll have one within the week. The subpoena covers personnel records for every signature on that batch's quality control chain." Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the document in his hands. 17 years of grief, of silence, of believing he'd somehow failed to save his wife because he hadn't pushed hard enough, hadn't fought loud enough, and felt something inside him crack open in an entirely different way than it had in that cockpit 4 days earlier. It wasn't his fault. It had never been his fault. Somebody had made a choice, a cold, calculated business choice to ship a part they knew could kill someone, and his wife had paid for that choice with her life, and for 17 years he had carried the weight of a lie that was never his to carry. "I need a minute," he said, his voice barely audible, and walked out of the conference room before anyone could stop him. He found himself standing at the end of the hallway, staring out a window at the Sky Nova hangar. In the distance, the same hangar where 4 days ago he'd been an invisible man with a mop bucket, and he let himself cry for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not the careful, controlled grief he'd rationed out to himself over 3 years, but something enormous and finally unlocked 17 years of injustice breaking loose all at once. Behind him he heard soft footsteps, and then Victoria's voice, quiet and uncharacteristically gentle. "I know this isn't the moment," she said, And I know you don't owe me anything, and I know I'm the last person who should be saying this to you. But for what it's worth, I don't think there was anything you could have done differently 17 years ago. You tried to warn them. They silenced you. That's not a failure on your part, Ethan. That's a failure of every person who had the power to listen and chose not to. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his hand, not turning around. Everybody keeps telling me that, he said quietly. Doesn't make it easier to believe. No, Victoria agreed. I don't imagine it does. But maybe, and I say this knowing I have no right to offer you comfort of any kind. Maybe the fact that you climbed into that cockpit 4 days ago, knowing everything you knew, having lost everything you'd lost, and you still didn't hesitate to risk your own life to stop it from happening to someone else. Maybe that's the answer to the question that's been eating you alive for 17 years. Ethan finally turned to look at her. What question? Whether you could have made a difference, Victoria said softly. You just proved in front of 200 people that you could. That you would. That's not nothing, Ethan. That might be everything. He didn't answer. But something in his chest, some fist that had been clenched tight since a hospital hallway 17 years ago, loosened by a fraction for the first time. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Carol. Sophie wants to know if you're a real hero now. I told her to ask you herself. She's waiting up. Ethan read the message twice, and for the first time in 4 days, something that felt almost like the beginning of peace settled behind his ribs. I have to go, he told Victoria. My daughter's waiting. Of course. He'd made it halfway down the hallway when Colonel Whitfield emerged from the conference room, his face tight with a new and different kind of urgency. Ethan, he called out. We found the name on the shipping authorization. Ethan stopped walking. Who was it? He said. Whitfield hesitated, glancing back toward the conference room, then at Victoria, and something in that hesitation made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up before a single word had been spoken. You're not going to like this, Whitfield said quietly. Say it. Ethan said, his voice low and steady in a way that scared Victoria more than if he'd shouted. Colonel Whitfield glanced down at the paper in his hand one more time, as if checking it might somehow have changed. The quality control authorization for that 2008 batch, he said slowly, was signed off by a division supervisor named Richard Voss. The name meant nothing to Ethan for a full 3 seconds. Then, something cold moved through him, memory clawing its way up from 17 years deep. Voss, he repeated. Richard Voss. You know him. He was my flight instructor, Ethan said, and his voice had gone strange, flat, distant. At Edwards, before he moved over to the manufacturing side, he was the one who signed my wings. He was... Ethan stopped, his jaw working. He was at the funeral. He stood right next to me at my wife's funeral and told me it wasn't my fault. He told me the accident board would find the truth. The hallway went very quiet. He knew, Ethan said, and the words came out of him like something being physically torn loose. He knew the coupling failed inspection. He signed off on shipping it anyway, and then he stood at my wife's grave and lied to my face. Victoria's hand went to her mouth. Where is he now? Ethan said. His voice had dropped to something almost inhumanly calm, the same calm he'd used inside that cockpit 4 days earlier when the tail rotor had cracked apart underneath him. Whitfield hesitated. Ethan, where is he? He's still with the company that manufactures the coupling, Whitfield admitted. He's vice president of quality assurance now, for Holloway Dynamics. They're the primary supplier for... He stopped himself, but it was too late. They're the primary supplier for Sky Nova. Ethan finished looking at Victoria. Aren't they? Victoria's face had gone white. Yes, she said quietly. They are. Have been for 6 years. Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh that had no warmth in it at all. So the man who killed my wife has been quietly supplying parts to your company this entire time, and nobody knew, or nobody wanted to know. I didn't know, Victoria said quickly. Ethan, I swear to you I had no idea any of this. I believe you, Ethan said, cutting her off, though his voice still carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. I do. But that doesn't change the fact that a man who shipped a part he knew was defective, who let it kill my wife, who lied to my face at her funeral, has spent the last 17 years climbing the ladder at a company that just tried to kill someone else with the exact same part. Nobody in that hallway had an answer for that. What happens now? Ethan asked, finally looking at Whitfield. Legally, what actually happens to a man like that? And Whitfield's face tightened. That depends on what we can prove. Falsifying a quality control record to conceal a known defect. If the documentation holds up, that's federal fraud, possibly manslaughter charges tied to your wife's death, depending on how the statute of limitations plays out given the new evidence. It won't be simple. Companies like Holloway have lawyers whose entire job is making sure evidence like this never sees a courtroom. Then we make sure it does, Ethan said. Ethan, Victoria said carefully, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. He looked at her, something wary sliding behind his eyes. What? Holloway Dynamics isn't just our supplier, she said slowly. They're about to close a merger with Sky Nova. It was supposed to be finalized next month. Full vertical integration, them building critical components in-house instead of us sourcing them separately. My board has been pushing for it for 2 years. It would have doubled our production capacity. Ethan stared at her. You're telling me you're about to merge with the company that killed my wife? I didn't know that when I agreed to it, Victoria said, her voice tightening with something between defensiveness and shame. The deal was structured by our board and their board 18 months ago. I inherited it when I took over as CEO. I have never once met Richard Voss in person. But you know him now, Ethan said. And you're about to hand him even more control over the parts that go into your aircraft. Not if what we're finding is true, Victoria said firmly. Ethan, I promise you if Voss knowingly shipped a defective part and covered it up, that merger is dead the second this evidence is confirmed. I don't care what it costs the company. I don't care what my board says. I am not putting my name on a partnership with a man who did what he did to you. Your board might feel differently, Ethan said quietly. Boards usually do when there's $200 million on the table. Victoria didn't answer that because they both knew he was right. The board meeting happened Friday morning, and Ethan wasn't in the room for it. He had no official standing to be there, no title, no seat at that table, just a janitor's uniform hanging in his closet at home, and a story that had become against his will. The biggest thing to happen to Sky Nova Aerospace in a decade. He waited outside in the same hallway where Whitfield had told him Voss's name 2 days earlier, sitting on a bench with his phone in his hand, half expecting a text from Carol about Sophie, half dreading whatever was happening behind those closed doors. The doors finally opened at 11:40. No, Victoria walked out first, her face unreadable, followed by 6 board members whose expressions ranged from grim to openly hostile. One of them, a silver-haired man Ethan didn't recognize, expensive suit. The kind of watch that cost more than Ethan's car, stopped directly in front of him. Mr. Cole, the man said, extending a hand Ethan didn't take. Franklin Meyer, board chairman. I understand you're the man responsible for all of this. I'm the man who almost died catching a defective part your company's been shipping for years, Ethan said flatly. If that's what you mean by responsible. Meyer's jaw tightened. The merger with Holloway Dynamics represents a $240 million consolidation that took 18 months to negotiate. I want to be very clear with you about what's at stake here before this goes any further than it already has. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you, Meyer said coldly, that there is a version of this situation where the coupling defect gets attributed to a single bad batch, a regrettable but isolated quality control lapse. Corrective action gets taken quietly, and everyone involved, including you. Mr. Cole walks away with their lives significantly improved. Sky Nova is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement. 7 figures. A permanent non-disclosure arrangement. Your daughter's education fully funded through graduate school. In exchange, we would need your full cooperation in characterizing this as an isolated incident unrelated to any prior program at Edwards Air Force Base. The hallway went silent. Ethan looked at the man for a long moment, and something in his chest, something that had been simmering since the moment he heard Richard Voss's name, finally reached its boiling point. You want me to say my wife's death and today's near catastrophe were unrelated, Ethan said slowly, so your company can keep its merger, and Richard Voss can keep his job, and nobody ever has to answer for shipping a part they knew would kill people. I want you to consider the well-being of your daughter, Meyer said, his voice softening into something that sounded almost paternal and felt to Ethan deeply obscene. You have a chance here to secure her entire future, financial security you will never see again in your lifetime. All you have to do is let the past stay in the past. Ethan stood up slowly from the bench. 17 years ago, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made every person in that hallway go still. A man stood at my wife's funeral and told me the truth would come out. He was lying. He knew he was lying because he was the one who buried the truth in the first place. And for 17 years, I believed I had somehow failed her, that if I just fought a little harder, argued a little louder, maybe she'd still be alive. I have carried that weight every single day since, and you are standing here in a hallway offering me money to bury that same truth all over again for a second time so your company doesn't lose a merger. Mr. Cole. No, Ethan said, and his voice finally rose, filling the hallway, drawing the attention of everyone still lingering near the conference room doors. You listen to me now. I don't want your money. I don't want your settlement. I don't want a non-disclosure agreement that protects Richard Voss for one more day than he has left. I want the truth in public in a courtroom if it has to be, so that every family who lost someone to a part that man shipped, knowing it was defective, finally gets to hear the words they deserved 17 years ago. And if that costs you your merger, Mr. Meyer, then I hope it costs you every single dollar you were counting on, because that is a price I will happily watch you pay. Meyer's face had gone rigid with fury, but before he could respond, Victoria stepped between them. He's right, she said quietly, and every head in the hallway turned toward her, including her own board chairman's. Franklin, the merger is dead. I'm not signing it. Not with Voss anywhere near this company, and not by asking a man who lost his wife to lie about it. Victoria, Meyer said sharply, the board voted. The board doesn't run this company day to day, I do, Victoria said, her voice hardening into something Ethan hadn't heard from her before. Not performance, not showmanship, just plain unwavering conviction. And I am telling you in front of everyone in this hallway that Skynova Aerospace will not merge with a company whose vice president of quality assurance falsified safety records that got someone killed. If the board wants to fire me over that decision, you're welcome to try. But I will not have this company's name attached to what Richard Voss did. The silence that followed was absolute. Meyer stared at her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes, and then without another word turned and walked back into the conference room, the other board members trailing uncertainly behind him. Victoria let out a slow breath and turned to Ethan. I'm sorry, she said. That should never have happened. I didn't know he was going to approach you directly. Would it have mattered if you had? No, Victoria admitted. I'd have told you exactly what I just told him, but I'm sorry you had to hear it from him instead of from me. Ethan studied her face for a long moment, and something in him, some deep, guarded wariness he'd carried since the moment she'd mocked him in front of 200 people 6 days earlier, finally slowly began to loosen. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Victoria said grimly. Meyer's not going to let this go without a fight. And Holloway Dynamics has lawyers who will bury us in litigation the second word gets out that we're walking away from this merger publicly over safety concerns tied to their VP. Let them try, Ethan said. Victoria almost smiled. You really aren't afraid of anything, are you? I'm afraid of plenty, Ethan said quietly. I'm just done letting fear make my decisions for me. I did that for 3 years. Look where it got me. The confrontation with Richard Voss happened 4 days later, and Ethan hadn't planned for it to happen at all. He'd been called to a deposition at a federal building downtown, a preliminary interview with NTSB investigators, nothing official. Yet just Ethan walking them through everything he remembered about the tail-rotor coupling, and at Colonel Whitfield's gentle prompting, everything he remembered about the accident 17 years ago. It was supposed to be a quiet private session in a conference room with a court reporter and 2 investigators. Nobody had told him Richard Voss would be in the building. He saw him in the lobby purely by accident, both of them heading toward the elevator bank at the same time. Ethan recognized him instantly, despite the 17 years, older now heavier gray hair where there had once been dark. But the same sharp eyes, the same posture of a man who had spent his career being obeyed without question. Voss recognized him too. Ethan watched it happen, watched the older man's face shift, from polite distracted unfamiliarity to something that drained the color right out of his skin. Ethan Voss, said his voice unsteady. Ethan Cole. Richard. Ethan's own voice came out steadier than he expected, given that his heart was hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. For a moment, neither man moved. The lobby around them continued its ordinary business, people walking past, phones ringing at the security desk. None of them aware they were standing 3 feet from a confrontation 17 years in the making. I saw the video, Voss said finally, his eyes darting away and back again, the eyes of a man calculating an exit that didn't exist. The helicopter. I didn't know it was you until, they didn't say your name at first, and then, you knew, Ethan said quietly. You knew the coupling failed inspection in 2008. You signed off on shipping it anyway. You knew it was the same part that killed my wife. Voss's face went the color of ash. Ethan, I don't know what you think I've seen the batch report, Richard. Ethan's voice remained level, but something underneath it had gone hard as steel. Failed ultrasonic inspection. Your signature on the shipping authorization anyway. Same batch number as the coupling in my wife's aircraft. That report. Voss's voice cracked. That report is 17 years old. There's context you don't understand. Production pressures, deadlines that came from 3 levels above me. I wasn't the only signature on that authorization. You stood at her funeral, Ethan said, and his voice finally broke 17 years of grief tearing loose in the middle of a crowded government building lobby. You put your hand on my shoulder and told me the accident board would find the truth. You told me to trust the process, and the whole time you already knew the truth. You'd known it for 6 months before she even got in that cockpit. Voss said nothing. His silence was its own confession, and both men knew it. Why? Ethan said, his voice dropping to something raw and broken. Just tell me why. Why did you ship it anyway? Voss's eyes were wet, now his composure finally cracking after 17 years of careful distance. We were 3 weeks behind on a contract deadline, he said quietly. If we didn't ship that batch, the Air Force was going to reassign the program to a competitor. I had 400 employees whose jobs depended on that contract. I told myself the failure rate was low enough that the odds were... He stopped himself, disgusted by his own words even as they left his mouth. I told myself it would probably be fine. It wasn't fine, Ethan said. She died, Richard. She burned alive in a cockpit because you decided a contract deadline mattered more than a failed safety test. I know, Voss whispered, and for the first time something that looked like genuine anguish crossed his face. I have known that every single day for 17 years. You think I don't carry this? You think I sleep at night? I don't care if you sleep at night, Ethan said, his voice rising now, drawing stares from people across the lobby. I care that you let me believe it was my fault. I care that you let an entire accident board write pilot error into a permanent record instead of telling the truth. I care that the exact same part almost killed someone else 4 days ago because you never fixed it, you never recalled it, you just kept shipping it for 17 more years. I didn't have proof it was the same failure mode." "You had proof," Ethan said. "You had a failed ultrasonic test with your own signature next to a shipping authorization. That's proof. You just decided it was easier to bury it than face what you'd done." 2 security guards had started moving toward them now, alerted by the rising volume, but Colonel Whitfield appeared from the elevator bank at that exact moment, moving quickly to intercept them. "Gentlemen," Whitfield said sharply, positioning himself between the 2 men. "This is not the place." "He knows," Ethan said, breathing hard, pointing at Voss. "He just admitted it. He knew the coupling was defective and shipped it anyway." Whitfield's eyes moved to Voss, whose face had gone completely white, his mouth working soundlessly. "Richard," Whitfield said quietly. "Is that true?" Voss didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence in front of a federal colonel and a room full of witnesses was answer enough. "I need you to come with me," Whitfield said, his voice hardening into something formal and final. "There are people upstairs who need to hear exactly what you just said on the record with counsel present if you want it. But you're not walking out of this building without giving a statement, Richard. Not after that." Voss's shoulders sagged, 17 years of buried guilt finally collapsing under its own weight in the middle of a crowded government lobby. "Okay," he said, quietly defeated. "Okay." As security escorted Voss toward the elevators, he turned back, once looking at Ethan with an expression that held no defense left in it at all. "I am sorry," he said. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't bring her back. But I am sorry, Ethan. I have been sorry every day since." Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching the elevator doors close on the man who had haunted the edges of his grief for 17 years, and found to his own surprise that he felt nothing like triumph. He just felt tired. And underneath the exhaustion, something that might eventually become relief. Mo. The story broke nationally 2 weeks later. Not the sanitized version Meyer had wanted, but the full one. Every detail of it published simultaneously by 3 major outlets after the federal investigation's preliminary findings were unsealed. Richard Voss was placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges. Holloway Dynamics stock dropped 31% in a single trading day. The merger, exactly as Victoria had promised, was formally terminated, and Skynova announced a full recall and reinspection of every aircraft component sourced from that supplier over the past 2 decades. Ethan watched all of it unfold from his sister's living room, sitting beside Sophie, who had insisted on watching the news segment with him, despite Carol's hesitation. "They're calling you a hero, Daddy," Sophie said quietly, watching his face fill the television screen. Not the exhausted, humiliated janitor from 6 days ago, but a photograph from a press conference Whitfield's office had released Ethan standing tall in a borrowed suit, jaw set, eyes steady. "I don't feel like one," Ethan admitted. "Why not?" He thought about that for a long moment, searching for an answer, honest enough for a 7-year-old and true enough for himself. "Because heroes get to save people before something bad happens," he said finally. "I couldn't save your mom. I was too late for her. All I did this time was catch something before it happened again. That's not the same thing as being a hero, baby. That's just doing what should have been done 17 years ago." Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering this with the particular seriousness she reserved for things that mattered. "I think that is what a hero is, though," she said finally. "Somebody who keeps trying even after something bad already happened to them. Somebody who doesn't give up just because it hurts." Ethan looked down at his daughter, 7 years old, wise beyond every year of it, and felt something in his chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" he said, his voice thick. "From Mommy's letters," Sophie said simply. "Aunt Carol kept a box of them. I found it. I hope that's okay." Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. He simply pulled his daughter into his arms and held her, the television still playing in the background, his own face still frozen on the screen beside a headline calling him a hero he still didn't fully believe he deserved. His phone buzzed against the coffee table. A text from Victoria. Board just voted unanimously to offer you the chief test pilot position on the Falcon 9X redesign. Full authority over safety review across every aircraft program. No pressure to answer tonight. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. Ethan stared at the message for a long time, Sophie still curled against his side, and felt the weight of an entire life's worth of decisions, balancing on the edge of a single choice. Ethan didn't answer the text that night. Bye. He set the phone face down on the coffee table and sat there with Sophie tucked against his side until she fell asleep mid-sentence, still talking about her mother's letters. And he carried her to bed the way he had 1,000 nights before. And he stood in her doorway afterward for a long time, just watching her breathe. The offer sat in his phone like a live wire. Chief Test Pilot, full authority over safety review. Everything he had once dreamed of becoming before a hospital hallway and a folded flag took that dream away from him. And now here it was again, being handed to him, not because he'd fought his way back into that world, but because a tail rotor had cracked apart at 15 feet and forced the world to finally see him. He didn't sleep much that night. The call came at 7 the next morning. Not from Victoria, from Carol standing in his kitchen doorway with her phone in her hand and an expression that made his stomach drop before she said a single word. Ethan, you need to see this. She turned the screen toward him. A news alert, stark and immediate. Holloway Dynamics v. P. Richard Voss found dead in apparent suicide hours before scheduled federal testimony. Ethan stared at the words until they stopped making sense as language and became just shapes on a screen. When? He said finally. Last night, around midnight. Carol's voice was careful, watching him for a reaction she clearly didn't know how to predict. Ethan, are you? I don't know what I am, Ethan said honestly. He sat down at the kitchen table, the phone still in Carol's outstretched hand, and felt something complicated and ugly move through him. Not grief, not exactly, but not triumph either. Something closer to the sick, hollow feeling of watching a door close that could never be opened again. Yay, Voss was supposed to testify that morning. On the record. Full account of the falsified inspection, the shipping authorization, the 17 years of silence. It would have been the final piece, the confirmation that made everything official, that turned Ethan's word and a battered old ultrasonic report into an undeniable federal record. Now the man who could have said it out loud, who could have looked a courtroom in the eye and confirmed everything was gone. His phone rang. Colonel Whitfield. You've seen the news, Whitfield said without preamble, his voice heavy. Yeah. I need you to understand something. Ethan and I need you to hear it clearly. His death does not end this. He left a written statement. Full confession notarized delivered to his attorney with instructions to release it upon his death. We received it 40 minutes ago. Ethan's breath caught. What does it say? Everything, Whitfield said quietly. Every detail. The 2008 batch. The pressure from above him. Names of 2 other executives who signed off on the decision alongside him. And Ethan, he specifically names your wife. He apologizes to her by name in writing. Says it's the thing he regrets most in his entire career. Ethan closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the kitchen table, hard enough that his knuckles went white. He gave us everything we needed to hold Holloway Dynamics accountable, Whitfield continued. In death, he did what he couldn't manage to do while he was alive. I know that doesn't fix what happened to you. I know it doesn't bring your wife back. But it does mean her name is now permanently officially part of the record that corrects 17 years of a lie. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, Carol watching him with quiet, worried eyes from across the kitchen. Is that supposed to make me feel better? He said finally, his voice hoarse. No, Whitfield said honestly. I don't think anything makes this better. I think it just makes it true, and sometimes true is the only thing we get to have. The federal findings were released publicly 6 days later, and this time there was no ambiguity, no corporate spin, no room left for anyone to call it an isolated incident. Richard Voss's written confession combined with the physical evidence Ethan had personally uncovered on a helicopter's failing tail rotor formed a case so complete that Holloway Dynamics Board dissolved its executive leadership within 72 hours, facing criminal referrals against 3 additional former officers and a civil suit that legal analysts estimated could cost the company north of $400 million.
Bounce-eye.
Skynova Aerospace, by contrast, emerged from the same story, with its reputation transformed rather than destroyed the company that had caught the defect, that had refused to bury it for the sake of a merger that had, however, imperfectly done the right thing when it mattered most. Victoria Hayes gave exactly 1 televised interview about it, and she used almost the entire segment to talk about Ethan. Ethan watched it from Carol's living room with Sophie curled against him, both of them silent as Victoria's face filled the screen. "I want to be honest about something," Victoria said to the interviewer, her voice steady, none of the old performance in it at all. "I mocked that man in front of 200 people because I couldn't imagine someone in a janitor's uniform knowing more than my engineering team. That arrogance nearly got someone killed. Ethan Cole is the reason it didn't. He is the reason a 17-year-old cover-up finally came to light. And he did all of it after this industry had already taken everything from him once." Some critics are saying the interviewer pressed that Skynova is using this story for good publicity, that the company is rebranding tragedy into a marketing moment. Victoria's expression hardened just slightly. "Let them say that. I don't care what it looks like from the outside. What I care about is that we found a defective part that's been quietly killing and nearly killing people for 17 years, and we're the ones who finally stopped it, because one man refused to stay quiet, even after this exact industry had already broken his heart once. If that's a marketing moment, then it's the most important one my company will ever have." Sophie looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide. "She sounds different than the video daddy, the one where she was laughing at you." "People can change, baby," Ethan said quietly. "Sometimes it takes almost losing everything to see clearly." His phone buzzed. Another text from Victoria sent seconds after the segment ended. "Still waiting on your answer, Ethan. No rush. But the offer's real, and it isn't going anywhere. Ja." He drove to the Skynova hangar 3 days later, alone without telling anyone he was going, and stood in the same spot where he'd once pushed a mop bucket across concrete, while pretending not to hear the engineers laughing behind him. The Falcon 9X sat in the center of the hangar, fully disassembled. Now its tail section spread across a workbench where a team of engineers pored over every weld and coupling with a thoroughness that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier. Victoria found him there 20 minutes later, standing quietly beside the wreckage of the aircraft that had changed both their lives. "You didn't have to come here to give me an answer," she said. "A phone call would have worked." "I needed to see it again," Ethan said. "The aircraft. I needed to remember what it felt like before I decided anything." "And what does it feel like?" "And what?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the disassembled tail section, the exact spot where a fracture no one else had bothered to check had nearly killed him 6 weeks ago. "It feels like the first time in 17 years I've stood in a hangar and not felt like I was hiding from something," he said finally. Victoria didn't say anything. She simply waited. "I'll take the job," Ethan said. "Chief test pilot, full authority on safety review. But I have conditions same as before. Tell me. Every single aircraft with a Holloway part in it gets grounded and re-inspected before it flies again. No exceptions, no matter what it costs, no matter whose contract it delays." "Already happening," Victoria said. "Company-wide policy as of this week. Second," Ethan continued, "I want a direct reporting line that bypasses engineering leadership entirely. If I flag a defect, it doesn't get buried in a chain of command where somebody with a deadline can overrule me. It goes straight to you and it grounds the aircraft immediately, full stop. No committee vote required." "Done," Victoria said without hesitation. "I'll have legal drafted into your contract this week." Third, Ethan's voice softened just slightly. I need flexibility for my daughter. School events, sick days, whatever she needs. I spent 3 years building a life where I could always be there for her. I'm not giving that up for a title, no matter how much it pays. Ethan, Victoria said quietly, you'll set your own schedule. That was never in question. He nodded slowly, looking back at the tail section one more time. There's one more thing, he said. Anything. I want the training program named after her, my wife. Every new test pilot who comes through SkyNova learns about tail rotor coupling failures, about supply chain integrity, about what happens when a company chooses a deadline over a warning light. And they learn her name while they learn it, not as a tragedy, as the reason the standard changed. Victoria's eyes had gone wet, and for once she didn't try to hide it. The Sarah Cole Safety Protocol, she said quietly. I think that's exactly what it should be called. Ethan's breath caught at the sound of his wife's name spoken out loud in that hangar, spoken with respect instead of buried in a footnote of a report that had lied about how she died. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. I think so too. 6 months later, Ethan stood at the edge of a new hangar. SkyNova had built an entire wing dedicated to safety testing and pilot training, and at the entrance hung a plaque with his wife's name and a simple inscription, in memory of Sarah Cole, whose warning should have been heard the first time. It will never be ignored again. Sophie stood beside him, 8 years old. Now wearing a small flight jacket Victoria had commissioned specially for her, embroidered with her own name stitched carefully above the pocket. Do you think Mommy would be proud? Sophie asked, looking up at the plaque. I think she'd be proud of both of us, Ethan said, squeezing her hand. Behind them, the new generation of SkyNova's test aircraft rolled out onto the tarmac, rebuilt from the ground up, every component traced, every supplier vetted, every coupling tested 3 times over before it ever left the factory floor. Ethan had spent the last 6 months personally reviewing every single one, and for the first time in 17 years, he did the work without flinching, without the old fear whispering that speaking up would cost him everything. Because it already had. And he'd survived it. And on the other side of that fear was a life he never expected to get back. Petrov approached them across the tarmac, the young mechanic who had once told Ethan to stick to his mop, now wearing the quiet, humbled expression of a man who had learned the hardest lesson of his career in front of 200 witnesses. Chief, Petrov said, and the title still sat strangely in Ethan's chest every time he heard it. We finished the stress analysis on the new tail assembly. Every coupling passed triple inspection. I wanted you to sign off personally before we clear it for the test flight. Ethan took the clipboard, scanning the data with the same careful eye he'd once used to spot a hairline fracture nobody else had bothered to check. Good work, he said, finally signing his name at the bottom. This is exactly what it should look like. Petrov hesitated before turning to leave. Mr. Cole, I never actually apologized for what I said to you. Back when... You don't need to, Ethan said quietly. You listen now. That's what matters. Petrov nodded, something like gratitude and relief passing across his face, and walked back toward the hangar. Yan Victoria joined them a few minutes later, watching the new aircraft with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had rebuilt not just a machine, but an entire culture around it. Reporters are already calling it the safest experimental aircraft program in the country, she said. Every major outlet wants an interview with you. National morning shows. A documentary crew reached out again, wanting to do a full feature, this time properly, not the ambush version from 6 months ago. Tell them no, Ethan said simply. Victoria raised an eyebrow. No interest in being famous chief test pilot. I already have everything I actually wanted, Ethan said, looking down at Sophie, who was watching the aircraft roll toward the runway with wide, delighted eyes. A job that means something. A daughter who knows the truth about her mother. And people who finally listen when I say something's wrong, instead of laughing and telling me to know my place. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since the day she'd mocked him in front of 200 people, it reached all the way to her eyes. You know, she said. "I told 200 people I'd marry you if you flew that helicopter." Ethan almost laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't let himself have in longer than he could remember. "I remember. I'm not proposing anything," Victoria said quickly, holding up both hands, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. "I just think it's worth saying out loud in front of your daughter this time, instead of a documentary crew that promise wasn't really about marriage. It was about respect. And I meant it even if I said it the wrong way, for the wrong reasons. You earned more respect from this company, from me, from everyone who watched that video, than anyone I have ever met in this industry." "Apology accepted," Ethan said. 6 months late, but accepted. Sophie tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward the runway, where the new aircraft was lifting smoothly into the afternoon sky, its tail rotor spinning clean and true, every fracture point triple-checked, every warning finally heard. "Daddy, look. It's flying just like you did." Ethan watched the aircraft climb steady and sure, carrying inside it 17 years of grief transformed into something that would keep other families whole, other daughters from growing up without their mothers, other pilots from trusting a machine that had already failed once and been ignored. "Yeah, baby," he said softly, pulling her close against his side. "Just like that." He thought of the mop bucket he'd pushed across that concrete floor for 3 years, invisible, silent, carrying a warning nobody wanted to hear. He thought of the hangar full of laughter, the CEO's cruel joke, the crack in the coupling that had nearly killed him and had instead somehow given him his life back. He thought of Richard Voss's final written words and Sarah's name on a plaque that would outlive every person standing on that tarmac today. Nobody in that hangar had believed a janitor could know more than an engineer. But truth had never needed a title to be true. It had only ever needed one person brave enough to say it out loud and keep saying it long after everyone else had stopped listening. And Ethan Cole, once invisible, once silenced, once nearly broken by grief, had proven in the sky above that runway that real character never announces itself with credentials. It reveals itself the moment everything is on the line and a man chooses to stand up anyway. And that more than any title, any salary, any apology ever could was the truth that finally permanently set him free.